Hi folks, and welcome to the video lecture on Rudolf Arnheim and his formalism and the notion of cinematic perception. So the things we're going to be talking about are what do we mean by cinematic perception for Arnheim, and what do we mean by formalism? First, let's fixate on this word perception. Rudolf Arnheim was known as a Gestalt psychologist. Gestalt psychology was a field of perceptual psychology that emerged around the early 20th centuries. And Rudolf Arnheim was a devotee of this particular school of thought, but even more so in Arnheim's writing on film, you can see the influence of Gestalt psychology. So what do we mean by Gestalt psychology? Well, there's a mantra of Gestalt psychology, which is that we perceive wholes and not parts. What does that look like? If you've ever seen diagrams like this one, especially images like this or images like this, those kinds of diagrams were circulated widely by Gestalt psychologists. We think of them as optical illusions, but they more so for the Gestalt psychologists illustrate certain perceptual principles of how we perceive the world in wholes and not parts. So if you look at this image for a moment, and for some of you, maybe most of you, there will be a moment when you stop seeing it as an abstract collection of dots and you'll start to see a form emerge. That kind of experience of emergence is a version of Gestalt perception. Or here, the fact that we can see two distinct wholes within one particular image, right? The vase and the two faces, or with the Necker cube, we can see it as jutting out this way or jutting out that way, is an example of seeing wholes. Gestalt means form or whole. So take a look at the rest of these, and some of them will actually come into play in Rudolf Arnheim's theory of cinema. So you can also have a bit of fun with Gestalt psychology. I want to say that the reason that we can easily see two faces in one singular face, these are both composite images of famous actors within famous movies, is a result of Gestalt psychology. They may seem like unfamiliar faces to you, but if you stare at them long enough, it's likely the case that a face that you recognize will kind of pop out as a whole and you can't unsee it. That kind of phenomenon is a Gestalt phenomenon. So where do we see this in Arnheim's writing? I want to take an important quote from Arnheim's writing that's not in our reading, but that really kind of captures the essence of how Gestalt thinking and Arnheim's film theory come together. He writes, "Even the most elementary processes of vision do not produce mechanical recordings of the outer world, but organize the sensory raw material according to principles of simplicity, regularity, and balance. This discovery of the Gestalt school fitted the notion that the work of art, too, is not simply an imitation, but a translation of observed characteristics into the forms of a given medium." The operative word here is organize, right? He's making a claim that art doesn't simply transform perception, but perception is already itself something that is organized, right? Arnheim is saying that we already add forms to what we see in the world. We don't merely see a kind of stream of chaotic data, we see forms, shapes, wholes. So that's kind of the perception aspect. What's this formalism term that I'm introducing? If you remember from our discussion last week, I brought it up with respect to the way some of us were talking about our theories about film. And I noticed that some of us in the class were already film theoretical formalists. What do I mean by being a formalist? Well, it's a kind of useful, but sometimes reductive, binary way of thinking about two strains of film theory. On the left, we have formalism. On the right, we have realism. The realist thinkers are those who basically are interested in film's capacity to reproduce reality, or you might call it physical or material reality. The thinkers most readily associated with that are Andre Bazin and Siegfried Kracauer and a handful of others. On the other side, we have film theorists who are obsessed with the idea that film doesn't reproduce reality, but that it transforms reality. So take this quote from Arnheim as kind of the beginning idea that spawns these two camps of thought. This is how Arnheim begins our reading. He says, "There are still many educated people who stoutly deny the possibility that film might be art. They say, in effect, quote, 'Film cannot be art, for it does nothing but reproduce reality mechanically. In many ways, this idea that film reproduces reality is the starting point for both sides, or at least some aspects of their theory will acknowledge this. What makes you a formalist or a realist is how you respond to that. The Arnheims will say, if it reproduces reality, let's think about the ways that it, say, maybe doesn't reproduce reality, or rather instruct filmmakers to stray away from the reproduction of reality. For your Bazans and your Krakauers, the idea is to say, if that's what it does naturally, let's think about aesthetic conventions that harness that power. So we can also think about formalism and realism in terms of not just filmmakers or rather theorists, but kinds of films, right? The Italian neorealists would be, as you might guess, placed under the realist camp. On the other hand, you might have Soviet montage or something like Battleship Potemkin, often associated with formalism. We might also think about early cinema as very quickly giving rise to two camps of realism and formalism if we allow ourselves to stretch that definition a bit further. Right? We have Lumiere with the realists and we have Georges Méliès with the formalists, simply because the Lumieres we generally think of as tapping into the film's or the camera's natural proclivity for capturing material reality, or Méliès, who's obsessed with camera tricks and special effects that deny that natural ability. So let's go back to those two basic questions from last time. What is cinema and what does it do? What makes cinema distinct from the other arts? What we might think of Arnheim as doing is taking the second question and expanding it and saying it's not just about what makes cinema distinct from the other arts, like theater. Of course, that's a big part of his argument, but he takes it a bit further and he says what makes cinema distinct from human perception. So we can think about Arnheim's project as starting with this problem that we mentioned a minute ago. Film cannot be art because it does nothing but reproduce reality mechanically. And he kind of places it along a spectrum. If this is the starting issue, what kinds of films might we make in order to avoid the problem? Well, in one part of his book, Arnheim will state the kind of most absolute formalist claim, which is that cinema will be able to reach the heights of other arts only when it frees itself from photographic reproduction and becomes a pure work of man and an animated cartoon or painting. So you can actually see this idea of formalism in its most extreme form with something like avant-garde non-representational animation, which was indeed proliferating in the 1920s when Arnheim was writing the essays that comprise the book Film as Art. But for the most part, Arnheim's writing is not a detailed analysis of abstract animation. It's actually looking at cinematographic recording in its place in film. And he'll look at this kind of middle position. He'll say, film does not quite reproduce reality mechanically, and I'm not only saying that film should avoid recording altogether by turning to animation. He wants to say something like this in the middle. By the absence of colors, of three-dimensional depth, by being sharply limited by the margins on the screen, film is most satisfactorily denuded of its realism. In other words, he's saying that if we pay attention to the properties of filmic recording, not just the capacities of storytelling and editing, but even more basically, the fact that the image is flat, that it has firm rectangular boundaries, that especially in the 1920s when he's writing, it lacks color, it also lacks sound. You can see that film is not in fact a pure reproduction of reality because of all the ways in which it doesn't approximate our perceptual richness when we encounter the world. And this very idea is going to be linked up to a recurring concept throughout Arnheim's writing in the excerpt that I asked you to look at. And that concept is called partial illusion. So he writes a little bit above and a little bit below this particular passage. Thus, film provides a partial illusion. It is always at one and the same time a flat picture postcard and the scene of a living action. So one way to make sense of Arnheim is to think about all the ways he wants to insist that film, despite having a perceptual richness that's analogous to our visual perception of material reality, is still, nevertheless, a picture, an image. It is flat, and it can be thought of as a purely formal kind of object. So what do we mean by formal object? Well, you can see that displayed in a number of passages. In fact, he does a lot of kind of mini close readings of scenes from films. In this one, he does a kind of abstract reading of what sounds like the famous train arriving at the station film. And you can see what he means by form when you take a look at this passage. This is what he says. He says, "Everyone has seen a railway engine rushing on the scene in a film. It seems to be coming straight at the audience. The effect is most vivid because the dynamic power of the forward rushing movement is enhanced by another source of dynamics that has no inherent connection with the object itself, that is, with the locomotive, but depends on the position of the spectator, or, in other words, the camera. The nearer the engine comes, the larger it appears, the dark mass on screen spreads in every direction at a tremendous pace, and the actual objective movement of the engine is strengthened by this dilation." So what is he doing here? Well, in some sense, he's telling us to look at an ordinary scene, something like this famous, first film from the Lumiere brothers, The Train Arrives at the Station, and he asks us to suspend our judgment that it is merely equivalent with what it represents, that is, a train moving close to the camera. And one way we can think about this is if we start to take away the details that make it a very strong, compelling representation of a train, and start to think of it as an abstract moving image of masses, of particles, or of lines and shapes, right? Thinking of it in terms of forms. He's really interested in this idea that you can think about this as a swelling of an object rather quickly, right? It's almost as if Arnheim thinks about film as if every film is an experimental film, right? Devoid of representation. He wants us to see that every film does indeed have those formal imaged qualities, but sometimes we forget about them because we think of content first and form second. So what's a kind of way we can think about this idea of partial illusion? Well, one example is camera movement. There's a section of the reading in which he talks about the phenomenon of the moving camera. And he talks about the way that it appears to our senses. In some sense, a natural understanding of camera movement is that it approximates human movement, right? When I move through the world seems to rush by, but for the most part, I see it as myself moving and the world is static. He thinks that that is in fact not always the case. So let's take a look at this passage. He says, "Certain parallels which are sometimes drawn between the functioning of the human eye and the camera, for instance, the comparison between the mobility of the eyes and that of the camera, are false." Once again, think about the kind of the large claim being made here. It's an intuitive claim that when a camera moves through the world, it's analogous to our eyes moving through the world. He says that's false. If the camera was rotated while the picture was being shot, very much so like in this well-known experimental film by Chantal Akerman called La Chambre, the bookcase, table, window, and door will proceed across the screen when the picture is projected. It is they which are moving. In other words, he wants to say that when I look at this particular image, I may indeed read it as a camera panning in a kind of 360-degree fashion. He wants to say that there's also a sense in which the objects move leftward across a two-dimensional bounded image. In almost every case, there's an element of twofoldness, of two-ness, or rather a partial illusion that's happening, right? I might say that the partial illusion is at its smallest in forward camera movement, because it's very hard to look at these instances without thinking about me moving through the space depicted. They have a very strong illusory quality. But as a formal experimental filmmaker like Ken Jacobs will demonstrate, there are ways in which we can, say, unlock the pictureness or the partial illusion that's always bound up in cinematic images, including that strongly illusory feeling of moving through the world, ushered in by a forward-moving camera. This is a film of Ken Jacobs called Georgetown Loop, in which he takes a early cinematic film, what's known as a phantom ride, a conventional form in which a camera was placed on the front of a locomotive, and then he quickly juxtaposes it with its mirror image. And very soon, what happens is that this no longer feels like a forward-moving camera. It looks like a two-dimensional abstraction. It looks like a Rorschach ink blot in many ways, or rather a moving Rorschach ink blot. And I think Arnheim would be very pleased with this experimental film because it seems to demonstrate that partial illusion, even though our habits of perception suppress it, we can kind of activate it through particular ways of making movies. I want to say that even in less experimental or not at all experimental examples, you can see a kind of partial illusion or maybe a twofoldness happening. This is one of my favorite sequences from movies. It's a scene in Leo Carax's Mauvais Song in which the lead character runs across the screen, but just think about what Arnheim might say about it as purely a kinetic moving composition. Okay, so imagine what Rudolf Arnheim would say if he was presented with this particular sequence. I think that it would demonstrate the fact that the effect that's produced, what we might call a kinetic effect, that's produced in this sequence, a kind of rhythmic visual intensity, is produced because not just the fact that the camera moves, but the way that it moves, that is completely sideways, and the fact that it is moving rightward with respect to a flat surface that is corrugated with alternating stripes of black and gray. And when we move across them, they kind of vibrate and give us this quality. And the quality is very much kind of flat. It's kind of a picture postcard, you might say, of a living action. And it's both a representation of a man running through space, but it's also much more than that, right? Its formal qualities are pronounced over and against the simplicity of its content. So how do we get from partial illusion to what Arnheim will call later in his writing twofold effects? Well, here's what I mean by twofold effects. He says, a twofold effect can be produced by a clever position of the camera. If an artist's impression is to be achieved, this double effect is necessary. It must not only show the subject in characteristic fashion, but must at the same time satisfy the spectator's sense of form. So he's saying a lot here. First, what I mean by twofold effect is something like this. There's a couple moments where he reads moments in Charlie Chaplin's films. This particular one is a gag in which we first see a kind of rolling ship. The camera is going back and forth to give us a sense that the ship is extremely rocky. And then we cut to Chaplin looking as if he's likely vomiting over the edge of the boat due to seasickness. But very soon, Chaplin will reveal the fact that this is not the case, but he was trying to reel in a fish. There's a twofoldness that is responsible for the gag happening, that we saw it as one thing with respect to what we saw before, and then it revealed that it was in fact another thing. Now, Arnheim is very obsessed with this kind of thing. Why is he obsessed with it? He seems to think that there's a particular artistic impression achieved with twofold effects like this. Partly because, for Arnheim, they emblematize the idea that film is always a partial illusion, that it's always two things at once. And also the fact that in each of these cases, the illusion is only produced with respect to where the camera is placed in space. In other words, it matters absolutely that we shoot Charlie Chaplin precisely from this angle, otherwise the gag would not happen. Munsterberg might say that this is important as a way to distinguish film from theater. Arnheim wants to say that there is a kind of greater importance to this kind of possibility in the cinematic medium. Right? The effect of surprise is achieved by making use of the fact that the spectator will be looking at the situation from a certain definite position. Right? So this twofold effect is a kind of aspect perception or multi-stability. So another reason that we might think Arnheim gravitates towards these examples is because they're extremely important in Gestalt psychology. They represent our proclivity for seeing the world in terms of wholes, right? In this case, I see two things at once, or rather back and forth, a duck and a rabbit. Once again, here I see two different positionalities of the Necker cube, and here I see two faces, and I go back and forth between seeing that and a vase. These things are ways of making sense of how we see the world. He's applying it to how we see film as distinct from how we see the world. And we already talked about this image in La Jetée as having a kind of multi-stability, right? It can be seen both as our protagonist kind of flying backward after he's been shot, but it also looks as if it's the figure of death, hooded with his right hand extended into the air. So that's all we're going to have for this particular video lesson. Next time, we're going to apply these ideas of partial illusion, aspect perception, and cinematic seeing to Jacques Tartie's Playtime.